fabulous introduction. I'm going to talk about some breeding bird monitoring work we've done, looking at bird response to oak woodland restoration and management at Indian Cave and Ponca State Parks. I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Mr. Stephen Brenner and Mr. Jerry Steinauer. So this is sort of the obligatory slide that everyone has to show during this conference, showing the BULs. I'm focusing on the Ponca Bluffs BUL and the Indian Cave Bluffs BUL. The former is located in northeastern Nebraska, and the latter is located in southeastern Nebraska. And interestingly, there are two state parks that are really important conservation properties that are within these two BULs. Indian Cave State Park, Ponca State Park, well known to a lot of people. And again, I'll just make that point once again, that these are two very important conservation properties in eastern Nebraska, because we don't have very many sites that are public properties that are this size. Indian Cave State Park is about 3,300 acres. Ponca State Park is over 2,000 acres. And both really have some of the largest tracts of oak woodlands, continuous tracts of oak woodland in the state. But even though they're very important, not only from a biological standpoint and recreational standpoint, that doesn't mean that they're potentially under stress and at risk of being compromised in one way or another. Invasive plants is one concern. A lack of management has led to a dense understory in some situations, invading these woodlands and altering the structure of these communities. And then in some situations, when deer have been overpopulated, overbrowsing can negatively impact these communities and woodlands. So some of the conservation strategies identified in the Nebraska Natural Legacy Project, and I'm going to just point out here that really the focus for me on this project is Indian Cave. So that's going to be kind of the focus, with Ponca being also a site where we've done work, but sort of in the background to some degree. I don't want to minimize Ponca, but it's just we've done more work at Indian Cave. So it may seem like this is a Indian Cave focused talk, and that to some degree is the case. But some of the conservation strategies implemented at Indian Cave are to highlight them here real quickly, are to thin that understory and midstory that has become very dense due to a lack of management, reintroduce prescribed fire. And that's really kind of the big story here, is reintroducing fire to these systems. Here's just some examples that Jerry provided several years ago of starting a fire in these oak woodlands down at Indian Cave. And in some degree, hack and squirt is used to thin out some of those understory trees. And that's where, from my understanding, you make a slash in a tree, inject some herbicide, and the tree eventually dies. And here's just another example showing, fire at Indian Cave State Park. And you'll notice that this is not, a major, canopy fire that's altering the community. It's pretty much restricted to the ground layer to a certain degree. This is not like fires you've seen recently in Colorado or California. But based on what I understand from a vegetative standpoint, the response to the ground layer has been pretty favorable. I don't want to get into this too much because there's a really good talk tomorrow with Krista Lang and Chance Brueggemann talking about the work that they've been doing, and they've been doing this work at these two sites. So if you really want to understand the ins and outs and ask questions about why certain management is being done in a certain way, really strongly encourage you to see their talk again tomorrow at 12:30 p.m. I'm interested in birds, which shouldn't surprise anyone. And really, when I first learned that this management was being reintroduced at these sites, the obvious question for me was, well, if you're doing all this management, how is this going to affect the bird communities at these two sites. And it becomes very relevant and important because, as I alluded to earlier, Indian Cave and Ponca both have important biological communities, and specifically a number of bird species that are of conservation concern that occupy these sites. A couple of tier 1 species, even though black-billed cuckoo is very rare, not likely to occur at Indian Cave State Park, and possibly not very likely to occur at Ponca anymore. But the wood thrush is certainly an important bird species. And then you have this laundry list of tier 2 species that occupy and breed at Indian Cave State Park. And some of these species also are found at Ponca State Park, which is shown by the asterisk. And then you have all these other species that aren't necessarily tier 1 or tier 2 species that also are found at these two sites. So a very rich breeding bird community. You know, and again, I just stress the importance that these are really two really important gems of conservation properties that we have in the state. So very interested in the breeding bird community and the impacts that management might have on these species. So naturally, if we're interested, or if we have a question about how is management going to impact the bird community, potentially the first place we would go to find answers to that question is looking at what's been done elsewhere. Unfortunately, there have been a number of other studies done throughout the Midwest, and I guess, you know, I don't know, I don't consider Tennessee and Arkansas the Midwest, but close enough to us where these results can be useful. It's important to point out that even though these studies may be helpful, the systems, the forests, the woodlands, the savannas, where this work was done, both have similarities and important differences to our sites in eastern Nebraska where we're interested. So even though these may be helpful and instructive, they also need to be taken with a grain of salt. But just to make some generalizations about what we would expect to see in regards to results, if you're going in and reintroducing fire and trying to diminish or decrease the amount of understory in these places, it should come as no surprise that understory species such as this eastern towhee are going to be negatively affected by those management actions. But species that will be positively impacted include canopy species. If you're not affecting those, the high canopy, the oak canopy, it should be pretty straightforward that you're not going to negatively impact those species. Bark cleaners, things such as white-breasted nuthatches and woodpeckers are other species that have shown positive results as a result of this type of management being reintroduced into these systems. And I think, you know, again, Krista and Chance may touch upon this tomorrow, but, you know, you talk to other people outside of Nebraska, you know, just how important, you know, reintroducing a lot of this management into forests, and not just forests here, but forests to the east of us is, you know, just very important for these woodland communities. So again, if we go back to our list of tier 1 and tier 2 species, we can make some judgments about how we think this management at Ponca Indian Cave State Park will affect these species. So again, understory species such as wood thrush, Acadian flycatcher, Kentucky warbler, and Louisiana water thrush, we might think, well, there may be some negative impacts. But others like Chuck-Will's widow and eastern whippoorwill, summer tanager, they may benefit from this management. And I'll just say right up front here that I'm not really going to talk about the chuck and the whip much more, just because the monitoring that we've done at these sites really is not, doesn't detect these two birds. These are two nightjars that are very difficult to detect, and we would have to do specialized surveys to really detect these. So even though we suspect that this management has been good on these two birds, we really aren't doing surveys, nocturnal surveys to detect these two species, even though we have done a few nightjar surveys at Indian Cave State Park in the last couple of years. And for the rest of our woodland breeders, again, we can make those judgments about what species we expect to benefit and which ones we expect to be negatively impacted. Again, woodpeckers, nuthatches, and a few others expect to be to benefit from the management, but things like house wren and Carolina red and gray catbird, ovenbird, all understory species that we would expect to be negatively impacted. But when we make broad generalizations, we run the risk of making errors. And so the story of fire in the wood thrush, this is an understory species to a certain degree. If we're reintroducing fire into these systems, we would expect that to negatively impact this bird. So, but based on this study from Ohio, what they found actually when they were comparing burned and unburned sites was that the abundance and nest success between the two different types of management units, these two metrics were very similar. What changed was that wood thrushes just selected or built their nests at higher parts of the forest canopy in those areas where you removed the understory. So again, generalizations sometimes can lead you in the wrong direction when talking about specific examples. So again, for wood thrush, the results were essentially a wash. Kentucky warbler, again, another species that I was concerned about when I heard about this management being reintroduced to these sites, because this is an understory species, and this is an understory species that we know has been present along in the Missouri River bluffs since the time of European settlement. So if you're removing understory, we might see this species disappear. And in some areas, deer overbrowsing has been a big problem for this guy. And this is a quote that I really like from one of those studies that just sort of says, if you're going to do management at in these type of systems, you're going to see pronounced effects, and the community structure that comes out the other end is going to be markedly different. So we can expect some big changes potentially, but it's also important to remember that suppressing fire for decades, if not close to a century or more at within these systems, which has been done, also has consequences. It may not be as dramatic as what we might see if we go in and clear a bunch of trees, but there's a slow creep and there are consequences for doing nothing as well. So there's trade-offs with whatever decision we make. So talking about the monitoring that we've done at Indian Cave and Ponca, again, why would we want to do this? I think I've made these points that these are within DULs, large continuous tracts of oak woodland. Management is being implemented, so that naturally leads to management questions. And, there's just been a limit. There's not much data from either of these sites. And again, that's a little bit surprising given that they are such important conservation properties in the state. So the objectives of the monitoring that we've done is to produce robust estimates of breeding bird density or abundance, but specifically we're producing density estimates. And our overall objective here is to build a long-term data set that we can use to evaluate and inform management. So our methods were, we started this work in 2012 and we did 3 years of surveys in a row, and that was to establish a good solid baseline understanding that we're going to see variation from year to year in densities of certain species. And then it was the plan all along to sort of complete, to redo the surveys at about 5-year intervals. So we did that in 2019, and we did the majority of the work in that year, but we had a few points that didn't get completed. So we went back and completed those in 2020. So we're considering the 2019-2020 as 1 point interval as part of this monitoring program. We have a pretty basic survey design. We have 5-minute, or we have a bunch of points randomly distributed throughout either property or in both properties, more in Indian Cave because it's bigger, and just more of a focus of our monitoring. We're using distance sampling that allows us to estimate detection and compensate for detection probability. People don't always detect birds, all species at the same rate. And it's really important to stress that this is not an experimental design. We didn't have the luxury of having blocks of where no management was occurring and where management was occurring. We don't have before and after data. This is monitoring that we're doing with the limited resources that we have. If we had more resources, it would be great to address all sorts of different questions and throw all sorts of grad students on different questions. But again, we have very limited resources. So we're just trying to collect as much information as we can to again inform management as well as we can with what we can do. So this is a map, and I'm going to thank Crystal Lang for providing the GIS data here. And this is Indian Cave State Park. This gives you a good sense of the amount of management that has occurred here. The black dots are our points. You can see how they're distributed across the landscape. But again, if you look at the color of those units, you see the number of times these areas have been burned. Some areas have been burned more than others. But again, the majority of the park has seen some level of management since about 2008, if it's my understanding. So results, and again, I just draw attention to this photo that, this photo from Indian Cave State Park is a consequence of the management that has occurred there. You see, this is probably a place where the fire got a little hot and killed some trees and created a little bit of an open space. That's probably just really kosher and potentially a positive thing to introduce some heterogeneity into the system because different species occupy different patches. We don't need a continuous uniform woodland system.
3 minutes.
What?
3 minutes.
I thought I had a half hour. We've done a lot of points, detected a lot of species, and going back to this point about some have been winners and some have been losers. Overall, for the species that we've been able to detect or estimate density, we have 5 that increased, 3 that declined, and 11 that remained relatively stable at Indian Cave. At Ponca, we saw 3 increase and 5 remained relatively stable. Some of the winners and losers. Yellow-billed cuckoo was a big winner at Indian Cave State Park. And this is notable because we've seen declines in of yellow-billed cuckoo throughout the state, sort of a long-term skid of this species. Eastern wood pewee is another bird. This is not a tier 1 or a tier 2 species that we've seen some increases at both Indian Cave and Ponca State Park, or at least the suggestion of an increase. Great crested flycatcher, another one we've seen an increase. And wood thrush, going back to this bird, just like with that study in Ohio, we've seen densities remain relatively stable. So that's a win in my book, since it's a tier 1 species. Same story with Kentucky Warbler. We've seen the bird remain relatively stable. One thing that's a little bit odd, at Ponca State Park, we saw house wrens actually increase quite a bit. The losers, the only real one that we can point to is American redstart, and this is not a surprise. This is not one we made a prediction about. This is neither a tier 1 or a tier 2 species, but intuitively this makes sense. Since this is a mid-story canopy species. And then some draws where we really don't have anything to say. I don't know what to say about this, but sometimes this is the results you get when you're estimating bird abundance. Acadian flycatcher is a species we expected to do negatively, but it seems to be holding its own. We've seen a lot of this, just sort of birds holding stable. And summer tanager is a bird we predicted would benefit from the action, but we're just not seeing that at this time as well. So looking ahead, this is where we're at with this monitoring. This is where we may be. And looking at, we're not seeing this scenario. If this was 3 tier 1 or tier 2 species, I would probably be calling up Jerry and Kristen saying, boy, we're really pushing the system in a direction that's not conducive for these birds. Can we rethink this? But that is not what we're seeing. So my conclusions, fire was in these systems. Management will affect the breeding bird community. Overall, we're seeing a generally positive response from the management, but there are going to be winners and losers with any management you do, even doing nothing. And again, this is just the beginning of a long-term monitoring program that we hope to build on into the future. So we do have a report online that you can go look at. If you want, feel free to email me if you want the link. Thanks to a lot of people, and hopefully that's reasonably within my time limits.